Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know it's a hard day, and we're so glad that you're taking the time out of your day to join us. I am Rabbi Avi Killip. I'm the Executive Vice President at Hadar. And one of the greatest honors of my role in recent years has been to help build the J.J. Greenberg Institute within Hadar and to work with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. So I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation today. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone knows about an opportunity to take this learning deeper through Project Zug. Zug is Hadar's one-on-one Chavruta learning program with over 30 courses to choose from, and over 150 of you on this call have already signed up to take Rav Yitz's course, which is called Theology and Ethics After the Holocaust, as a follow-up to today's conversation. Over 200 people have already completed that course in the previous cycle. So if you registered already for that, you'll be getting your course materials a week from today on May 5th. So keep an eye out on your email for that. If you are not registered to learn in this cycle, we will put a note in the chat right now with the form, so you can still register to join us. And if it doesn't work out for you to learn with Zug right now, this and all the classes remain available and will be available again this summer. So registration for the summer cycle opens on May 9th, and you can sign up to be notified when that summer cycle opens. So we'll post a form, share a form link for that as well. And I just want to speak personally and say that I actually had the opportunity to learn through this entire Zug course with a Chavruta. And I can tell you it was as rewarding as it was challenging to engage with the topic. It's hard to set aside time in your day to stop and really contemplate and grapple with the Shoah, and it's equally rewarding and important. So I want to make my own personal plug for that as well. And as we turn to our conversation today, it would be impossible for me to overstate the influence that you, Rav Yitz, and your Torah and your teaching have had on my life and the lives of my family and my teachers. And I think it would be hard to overstate the significance of Rav Yitz's thinking and teaching on the Shoah for the Jewish people. So I'm so grateful to be able to spend this time today here with him and with all of you to have this important conversation. I just want to note that we're going to leave the chat feature off for this session. So if you have a comment or a question, please feel free to chat those directly to Morty Labaton, who is Hadar's Director of Programs, who's moderating the comments today. So thank you to Morty. And Rav Yitz, I think I'd like to start here with this day. Today is Yom HaShoah, and you have said that Yom HaShoah is a sacred day, just like all of our other holidays, like Pesach or Sukkot or Purim. And, serious thinkers and teachers have proposed other alternatives for remembering the Holocaust. Could have been part of Tisha B'Av, or another fast day, another minor fast day. Could have been Holocaust Remembrance Day. Can you tell us why this day, Yom HaShoah, is so important and sacred?
First, I want to say, I'm looking forward to this conversation also. Rabbi Avi and I have a relationship goes back 2 generations, meaning her parents were students with me, and really great personal impact. You learn more from your students than you do from your teachers. So, excuse me. So the net result is that this is looking forward to this. And of course, when you want to talk about Yom HaShoah, it is something the whole Jewish people has been wrestling with for a good, ever since it happened. And in fact, the truth is sometimes when people press me, I tell them the honest answer is I'm not thinking about this issue. I'm trying to describe how the Jewish people is behaving in response to this issue. We'll come back to that maybe later. Why is Yom HaShoah so important? There are many things one could say, but I'll start with this. One of the most remarkable things about our Torah and our religion is that it's not embedded, or it's not anchored in the past. And I believe the central teaching, or the central revolutionary teaching of Yahadut is in fact that the creator God, the one God, this is what everybody who credits Yahadut as being the source of, the most important thing is not that there is this one universal creator force, but rather that this universal infinite power nevertheless is deeply interested in humans and in this planet and in this life. And in a way, this is the Torah's teaching, that as God has entered into a partnership, into a covenant, a brit with humanity, to repair this world and to bring it up to the level of perfection, of repair that creatures and life, all life deserves, but creatures who are created in the image of God certainly deserve. So it starts with that. So the whole point is Jewish religion. It's not enough to say, well, we had this great Exodus experience on Pesach, we just finished celebrating. The whole religion is oriented toward this future goal of repairing the world. And therefore, what happens along the way is terribly important. So the Torah not only records Pesach, but the tradition goes on to record Purim, Hanukkah, the experiences along the way that confirm or at least support the idea that there is justice in this world and that the good will win, that life will win. But the same token, it also incorporates, it must incorporate tragedy, defeat. For one, because you have to ask yourself, is this credible? Or you're teaching, the religion is teaching that life will win out over death, or that justice will win out over evil and oppression. Well, okay, you want to teach that, but is that credible in the presence of a destruction of the temple, of an exile that for every other religion and people ended their career? And is it credible after such a horrific cataclysmic tragedy? So it seems to me that's the first and critical question. We'll come back to it all evening because that's really been the all day. Sorry, I'm speaking from Israel. We'll come back to that, but it starts with this challenge to everything we believe in. And so the first important point about Yom HaShoah is it depended on understanding the importance of this event. I mean, one could put it this way too. The Shoah and the creation of Israel some decade later, that these are two of the major events of all of Jewish history, not just of the past century. So Yom HaShoah could not come into being unless A, the religion is still alive and generating calendar and days of memory, just as it has for 2,000 or 3,000 years. And when it stops doing that, it's dead, it's not existent. And we're not a fossil religion, although some people practice it that way. So that's number one. And secondly, and just for the actual record, immediately after the war, there was not that much pressure for a day of recognition or memory. And so part of the sadness of the tragedy, that many people looked down on the Shoah and looked down on the survivors. Somehow they were not, they didn't fight, they didn't do this. So the truth is, at the beginning, the chief rabbinate was the first serious proposal, and it wasn't serious. The first proposal the chief rabbinate made was the Yom HaKadish HaKlali, a generic day of saying Kaddish for the 6 million. Why? Again, a legitimate answer, because millions of them, there was no date of death that was known, and B, they had no family surviving to say Kaddish for them. So the idea that Jews would say it on a general day as a Kaddish for all is very meaningful. But they came back and said that this day should be Asara B'Tevet. Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, is the minor, maybe the most minor of the 4 fast days that mark the destruction of the temple. You look back, what you're really hearing is a proposal to make relevant to Asara B'Tevet, which is neglected and run down, rather than a serious attempt to confront or to remember the Shoah. So frankly, the proposal fell on its face, fell flat. No one really took it up. People hardly took it up. So what happens next? Well, it turned out, as I said, the only people who felt confident and convinced that you must push for a day were not only survivors, but the Zionist youth movements, the fighters, the people who had been survived the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Why? Because the other people will look down upon you, a sheep to the slaughter. they were the people who felt, no, I fought, so I'm heroic, so I have a right to speak up. So they demanded and eventually persuaded the Knesset to set up a special day of commemoration. To me, it's a very sad that the rabbinate didn't understand and take the lead. It took a Knesset, a secular, so-called secular Knesset, take the lead. But they demanded this, and here's the paradox of their demand. On the one hand, they were right, it deserves a day. On the other hand, they were so fixated on the fact that they had fought, and this was the honor and dignity of Jews, that some Jews had fought, that they asked April 19th, the day of the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, should be made a Yom HaShoah. And so the truth, first of all, is if they had gotten their way, it would have been a tragedy. Why? Because with the years, the bulk of the Jewish people came to realize you're not just honoring the fighters and ashamed of the victims, so-called. It's the opposite. First of all, of the millions who died, many of them, till the moment they were killed, they resisted in the most powerful way by living like Jews are living more ethically and decently, by holding their family together, by holding their values. And for many, that was the maximum they could do, but it was an incredible action. So a day that would have honored the fighters and put down the other millions who could not fight, who could not get armed, who could not arise in this way, would have been a real setback. What saves the day is a paradox again about the Jewish people. The actual day of the revolt was the first day of Pesach. It was in the month of Nisan. It was the first day of Pesach because the Nazis were trying to wipe out the Jews, and they decided that the best way to finish off Warsaw Ghetto, they already killed more than 250,000, 300,000 Jews already, but they wanted to finish off the last ones on Pesach, Dafka on Pesach, because they wanted to show that not only are they destroying the Jews, but that the Jewish religion, you take the days of redemption and freedom and turn them into days of death and destruction. So the Nazis, as a result of this, ended up with a revolt that started on Pesach. Now, so the Orthodox Jewish response to this proposal for April 19th was, Nisan, the whole month has been a month without days of sorrow and mourning, because in celebration of the Pesach. And certainly we're not going to accept the idea of a day of mourning and destruction on Pesach itself, which would shatter the holiday. We're not ready for that either. So they objected, and they tried to put off. So you couldn't resist the fighters because their demand was recognized as legitimate. And so all the Orthodox could do is say, well, let's delay it. Let's not do it. So their original dream was to push it off into the month of Iyar, because they wanted to keep Nisan without a day of sorrow. So the compromise, I'll say, the whole Jewish people, Klal Yisrael, is smarter than any one group. The fighters were right about Yom HaShoah, but wrong about honoring only the fighters. So they didn't get their way, except finally it was pushed off from first day of Pesach, which is the 15th of Nisan, to the 27th. So it was still in the month, it was still reasonably close, so they were unhappy, but they accepted it. The Orthodox, on the other hand, also were unhappy that the month of Nisan is in some way attacked or undermined or loses its purity of joy. But on the other hand, it wasn't Pesach that was destroyed. So both sides were frustrated, and both sides got what I think was the right response. And so Yom HaShoah came into being. Israeli Knesset passed it, and there has become, and therefore, and this is my argument, that Kedusha now, the famous Soloveitchik comment, the bracha is Mekadesh Yisrael Vazmanim. Shabbat is sanctified by God, but the holidays are sanctified by the Jewish people, Yisrael Vazmanim. And the Torah, it says that the Jewish people, will establish Rosh Hashanah and the actual dates of the holidays. So I consider this a profound continuation of Jewish history and Jewish religion, its birth and its growth and its increasing influence, even though paradoxically enough, as I say, it took disagreement, contradiction, that this is a triumph of pluralism, where all the different viewpoints negotiated and ended up with the best possible result.
Thank you so much for that answer. As always, in addition to learning about the Shoah, you're also teaching us so much about what are holidays even, and what is that Kedusha, and also what is Klal Yisrael, and how do we function as a people? There's so much wrapped up in that answer.
Thank you for saying that. I'll tell you something that occurred to me this morning again. We're in Israel, Jerusalem, my wife and I and our family, and Israel, really, Yom HaShoah is amazing. The whole country focuses. They close down all the theaters and all the standard stuff, and TV and radio. It's all about the Shoah completely. At 10 o'clock in the morning, as on Yom HaZikaron for the fallen soldiers, which comes in a week's time, at 10 o'clock, there's a siren that goes off, a 2-minute siren, and the whole country stops. Literally, you'll see on the roads, cars on the road pull over and they stop, and people step out on the major highways, and they're all standing there and so on. I think of it every time it happens, but my last conversation with Rabbi Soloveitchik, again, from whom I have unlimited respect and honor, and I certainly feel one of my most influential personal teachers. Yet, the last conversation I had with him, he suffered from Parkinson's, in the last probably 8-9 years of his life, he was not available for conversation. But I used to visit him every summer, and we would talk. And I was writing this book on the last conversation I had with him. I told him I'm writing a chapter in Yom HaShoah, and I said, I want to ask you a question. Because what happened was that in the 1980s, when Menachem Begin became prime minister, he got together with Rabbi Soloveitchik, and the two of them pushed very hard to change the day of memory of the Shoah to Tisha B'Av. And in the end, they failed. And thank God they failed, because, in fact, the overwhelming stand of the survivors and of the Jewish people and of the Knesset, which is a political that responds to majorities, was we have Yom HaShoah, we're not going to switch to Tisha B'Av. So I asked the Rav, why did you push so hard for Tisha B'Av? It was already established the other. And it was really an extraordinary conversation, because he says to me, look, he said, I believe 100% that the Shoah is central. We must bring this whole catastrophe into our religion, into our religious understanding, into our lives. He said, I'll tell you why I switched to Shoah. He said, this day was created by a secular Knesset, and the secular Israelis and the fighters, they were all secular. He said, I'm really worried. In this first generation, when they're still alive, yes, they'll keep it. But they don't know what the Orthodox Jews know, the Halachic Jews know, how to keep something going for 2,000 years after the Churban. He said, so I really pushed for this because I was worried that 50 years from now, Yom HaShoah will dwindle and disappear. And God forbid the memory of the Shoah will disappear. And that's why we must connect it, or I tried very hard to connect it to Tisha B'Av. And I told him, I wanted to, forgive me, I very rarely would argue or disagree. I said, I want to tell you what my father taught me every year, every day. He used to say to me, trust the Jewish people's religious sense. They are much more deeper. He quoted this famous Gemara, Hanach lahem, leave it to the Jewish people. If they're not prophets anymore, prophecy ended. They're the children of prophets. So their religious spirit is much stronger and deeper than you think, and maybe deeper than great rabbis or great religious teachers. Mm-hmm. And in effect, I said to him, I really think that you're underestimating them, that Yom HaShoah is not just a one generation wonder. It's going to really be the future. And I see this now, and again, just this siren, this is unprecedented in Jewish history, but it's so powerful, and the whole country, literally, the whole country, I can't think of a halachic practice that is so universal and so powerful. That's one example. Of course, they've developed since other ideas, many of which you'll recognize. Reading names, everybody reads names of the relatives and family they lost. So again, they're not numbers, they're not anonymous. Those names live on. Or the idea of lighting candles, which of course has become very universal. So my point is that Yom HaShoah in part reflects also the greatness of the Jewish people and Klal Yisrael, the whole Jewish people. When the secular and the religious have to negotiate and work on it together, they get a better result than when each one pushes their truth but leaves off the other person's truth. So Yom HaShoah, in my mind, again, I know America, it's more chancy, and I sometimes worry that the assimilation will undermine Yom HaShoah as it will undermine other things. But in Israel, particularly, it seems to me, you see the power of the whole Jewish people to forge vehicles of memory, days of experiences of memory that are truly, I believe, will be everlasting.
Yeah, thank you. I do think it's not the same, certainly, but I do feel the same thing, right, is happening here in America. It's so present. I want us to, we've been talking about the memory of the Shoah on this day, or on which day. I want to zoom out a little bit and ask more broadly beyond a particular day of memory. You referenced at the beginning how we think about the Exodus from Egypt. I want to ask, how central should the Holocaust be in our understanding of Jewish history? We talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, in every moment, in everything we do, in every day's tefillah. So how should we be thinking about the Holocaust? Is this story that central a story of our Jewish history? And then the second part of the question is, of course, how do we make sure that we keep that memory and also don't end up seeing all of Jewish history as primarily just a story of tragedy? How do we hold it? But really, first, would love to hear you speak just about how big should this be in our understanding of the history of the Jewish.
Well, you'll have to help me, or your judgment may be just as good as mine. As the Gemara says that now we're in an age where prophecy has ended, but it's passed to children and fools. So I can't claim that I know the future here entirely. But and my answer again is essential. I'll come back to my basic claim that the central core of the religion is its future orientation, its promise of tikkun olam, its promise of messianic age in which we overcome all the enemies of life. That's the real goal. So again, what's happening along the way is not minor or sideshow. It's part of and even the Exodus. I go back, the credibility of the Exodus Pesach, it is fundamental. And you're supposed to remember it every single day. There's a folk custom that lists a group of zechirot. At the end of davening, you say a list of psukim that refer to certain central memories, core memories that you should have every day. And one of them is, of course, Yetziat Mitzrayim of the Exodus. Other examples that remember Amalek and their attack on you and so on. I believe that no question in my mind that Zachor, which was one of the slogans that the survivors, the victims painted, talked about all the time, remember us. That was, they knew they were going to be wiped out, but they asked to be remembered. Mm-hmm. So I believe that literally that's one of the daily memories. Plus, as I say, these events are so magnitude. So the Exodus is not just because of the one-time Exodus from Egypt. It is seen by the tradition as the down payment. The Jewish people experienced going from slavery to freedom. Someday the whole world will go from slavery to freedom. The Jewish people went from slavery to national independence and dignity and homeland. Someday all nations and all people will have dignity in their homeland and their own lives with proper dignity. So the Pesach is remembered, but it's remembered also as a spur to action and the credibility of the future home. Now, in the same way, the rabbis incorporated the Churban. The Torah incorporated Churban first, because coming to grips with tragedy and setback, does that end the whole claim that the world will be redeemed? Does that mean that the covenant is finished because God has rejected us and we're now in exile? That's what the Christian interpretation was. So the rabbis taught us that we have to include everyday remembrance of the destruction of the temple. We have to have many rituals that remind us, and not because it refutes the hope of life winning out, but rather it tests that belief. And you can see, that it goes on, or you can see in the response to the Khurban, the recreation of life, so that remembering the Khurban becomes a way of deepening the message of life, not of death. Mm-hmm. And I believe the same thing is happening, will happen, and is happening with the Shoah. It is the ultimate test because there was no catastrophe of equal proportions any time in Jewish history. And therefore, the whole credibility of the whole religion is at stake. And how do you go on? Can we go on? So the answer I give, I think that Jewish people and Jewish history is given, is yes, we didn't respond by giving up. I read more recently, the man describes how his uncle and his father and another brother, two uncles and a father, they were survivors, came back to Poland after the war. And they sat and they talked for 3 days, whether they want to now disappear as Jews. Why should their children, why should their grandchildren be exposed to such horrible risks? And after 3 days, they wrestled with it and they said, no, they don't care what the risk is, what the challenge is. They are remaining faithful to this and they'll go on. And of course, the Jewish people did that. 25,000 Jews, it's estimated, in France disappeared, meaning they consciously chose non-Jewish identities. They tried to escape. We're getting in Poland, Madeleine Albright recently died. Her parents did the same thing. They converted to Christianity. They passed. They never told her. At least she claims they never told her that they were Jewish. But the vast majority did the opposite. They deepened, and the survivors too. They deepened their life. They rebuilt. The Jewish people built Israel, the greatest outburst of life for our history. So that's my answer. Is it not only is it central, but its centrality strengthens the entire message. And that is the answer to your second question about credibility or the danger of the religion becoming a religion of death. There is a danger in one way, namely, so the Holocaust impact has grown so powerful now that there's a significant number. The AJC did a study a couple of years ago when people were asked, what is the most important expression of being Jewish? It turned out that the highest rating, 82%, said, remember the Holocaust. 29% keep kosher. I mean, it's a little shocking maybe, but it's real. So there is a danger that people who know nothing of Jewish life but the Shoah may end up thinking of the Shoah as the whole story of the Jewish religion. So it's one of our major responsibilities. It's one of Hadar's important contributions is to teach a Torah, the Torah of life, the broader tradition, which again, I'm finishing a book now. I hope I'm finishing a book now. It's been going on for more than a decade, which is called The Triumph of Life. The main message of Jewish tradition, I claim, is that God is the God of life who loves life, who asks human beings to join in making sure that this planet, life wins out, that on this planet is so improved that every form of life gets the safety, security, and dignity it deserves, not just humans, but all forms, but certainly humans at a much higher level than at present. So the responsibility of people who take the Shoah seriously is also the responsibility of the whole Jewish people to make clear that while this is a great challenge, we don't ignore it. While we have to even change, I'll argue in a moment, our thinking about the religion and life because of the Shoah. On the other hand, we don't lose sight of the central primacy of our message. Our message is all about life and choosing life, and that every action in our personal lives should be oriented toward life. But to orient to life doesn't mean you have to deny death, and you certainly should not suppress or deny suffering or tragedy.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer, and it makes me realize the sort of false binary in the question, in the way that I posed it of, should we remember the Shoah always, or should we have, a religion of life? And it's actually like, no, remembering the Shoah is that is what directs us towards that religion of life, not it's not something that has to be like counteracted. If we're doing,
it's a generation that's working on improving or overcoming established binaries, many of which have perfectly important insights, but when they're absolutized, they become very misleading. And that's a good example. Yes, I mean, I resented it. I was very involved in the development of Holocaust memorial centers and the museum. And people, again, they mean well, but I can't tell you how many times people published articles, too much money, too much attention to being the Shoah. Yeah. We need life, not death, kind of stuff. And I took it very personally. In part, a personal story. I was the executive director of the President's Commission that recommended the museum, and Elie Wiesel was the chairman. We were very close. And when the museum was adopted by Congress, multiple levels of that, it was an exhibition and research and education and so on. So Elie said to me at the end of the conversation, I think you should try to stay on in Washington and try to be the director of the museum, because we're so committed to Holocaust memory, and this is an incredible opportunity, which of course it was and is. And I said to him, honestly, I was then also the founder of Killip, which was a much weaker and struggling organization. And I said to him, honestly, I'm afraid if I would stay in Washington, that Killip wouldn't make it. And I feel the message of Killip, which is the whole Torah, pluralism, all the Jewish people, not just one denomination, is more important right now. So let's find somebody who wants to dedicate a very important work of lifetime to Zachor itself. So, but then I was a little probably oversensitive. Maybe I felt inside a little insecurity when people would then say, you're pushing this memory of death and not of life. And again, I think the record shows that despite the Holocaust, not only in Washington, but the memorial centers throughout the world, there are now 250 and building around the world. There's more money being spent on Jewish education now than ever before, as it should be. And I still think, again, that's the common sense and good judgment of the Jewish people, that they don't lose sight of life or of education, and no matter how much they honestly remember and should remember the tragedies and the catastrophes.
So I want to shift our conversation a little. We've been speaking about the role of the Shoah in Jewish history, and I'd like to ask about the role of the Holocaust in theology, both theoretically and in our personal relationships with Hashem. Given the weight and the power of the event, how does this impact our relationship with God? And I want to, in particular, highlight, I know this is a topic about which your thinking is both very well known and also has evolved over time, that many of us, I'm sure many of us on this call are familiar with a concept that you taught, that you called voluntary covenant. And so can you tell us, how has your thinking changed? What is, or what was that concept? What is the concept of voluntary covenant, and how has your understanding shifted? And where are you now in your thinking about that, and what the Shoah has to teach us about theology, and or what we have to learn about theology from the Shoah?
It's a fair question, and the truth is that you were nice to calling it evolving or changing, growing over the years. The answer is, I'll speak for myself personally. When I had some vague, I'm sure, memory and ideas about the Shoah, but not until 1961 I came to Israel. At the time, I was an American academic historian, and I was an assimilationist Jew. I was trying to become all-American, and I was a student of intellectual history, modern intellectual history. So my PhD was in. And then I stumbled into the Shoah, and it really was quite devastating. I was an Orthodox Jew, an Orthodox rabbi, very happy, very fulfilled in my observance, in my feeling about Torah, my family's life as religious Jews. This was overwhelmingly, it was devastating. It really knocked me completely off my balance. Why? Well, for one, again, whatever way you understood Torah, I felt in a world in which God in some way rules, or God is present, in which Torah promises will be a world eventually of justice and dignity. How for 12 years and for mass murder and cruelty and extermination, and God didn't stop it. And it was really quite shocking. I remember a line from Elie Wiesel once in a symposium around Purim. He said, he said, we thought we had a covenant with God and a deal and an understanding. We protect the Torah, and we keep and protect the Torah, and God keeps and protects us. Well, he said, in light of the Shoah, for the first time, maybe we have to say the covenant is broken. Well, eventually I incorporated that idea into my thinking too, but I was personally broken. The days when it took over my life. I spent a whole year where I was supposed to be teaching American history. I was, but that was 4 hours a week. And the rest of the time I was just living Yad Vashem and reading, and devastating. Again, so in trying to come to grips with this whole experience of recognizing the inadequacy, that's what it was. And above all, as I said, I could not accept the idea that God had done nothing, at least nothing that I could see visibly, to stop it. How could that be? And can you believe in God? And I remember days when I would put on my talis and tefillin, because I was a good Orthodox Jew and very, very fulfilled in it. And then when I would try to start to say the words, and I'd suddenly remember what I was reading yesterday or in the morning, and I would choke. I couldn't say the words. I felt I'd be lying. I felt so I won't go through all the stages, but in the first stage of it, I was so shocked, we might say, that I ended up kind of with a draw. So what I said was, I spoke of moment faith. The answer is, Sunday, half the time, or many days, you feel the presence of God, you feel Pesach, you feel Exodus, you feel Torah, and its fulfillment. And there are whole days, many days, when I just see before my eyes the burning, the crematoria, the burning of children, which to me were alive, which was the lowest point of Holocaust experience. And in such a moment, when you're looking at it honestly, there's no God. There is certainly no God present. You can't feel the presence. You're cut off. So I started by saying maybe the answer is moment faiths, that we believe sometime and we don't. Remember, Michael Wischerman was a close friend and a deeply devout and a profound philosopher. He once wrote a review. He said, you're all crazy. You're nuts. You can't believe in God on Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday and not believe in God on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I said to Michael, that's a very nice philosophical statement, but that's not true. Yeah. I'm sorry to say that. Just the reality is very different. So that in a way I said, so I conclude what? I conclude that a believer is part of the time, no matter how whole. In fact, it's sort of a bit of a joke. The faith is broken, but again, there's no faith so whole as a broken faith. So you have to live with that. And it was very consoling in a way. And I found later that many people, not for the Shoah, but for other reasons, who had doubts, found this helpful. Right. But I wasn't satisfied, and it certainly wrestled with it. I kept working at it. And then you mentioned voluntary covenant. I had this paradox, but it carried me through the struggle. When I discovered the Shoah in Jerusalem that year, I also discovered the state of Israel and the life of Israel. And I, it was amazing. I would spend the whole day Yad Vashem drowning in death, chilled to the bone by the horrifying things I was reading. I go out into the sunshine of Jerusalem, and the prophetic words were being fulfilled before my eyes. And Yirmiyahu said there will be days there will be joy and singing, and there will be weddings, and there'll be kala and chatan right here in Jerusalem. And lo and behold, that was happening. Mm-hmm. So it was like maybe Jekyll and Hyde, maybe it was bipolar. But so that, number one, is that one reason I didn't crumble, I think, was that because I had this dialectical experience of life and fulfillment of prophecy and covenant, and I saw the Jewish people. So at this desperate point, I came up with this thought. I was trying to make meaning out of this or trying to understand it. That's what thinking is about, even though it doesn't have, there's never an explanation, never a full understanding of certainly of the Shoah. So I said, on the one hand, the covenant is broken. God didn't save the Jews and should have. And on the other hand, the covenant is functioning. It's functioning. So how do you explain that? And I was influenced by a Christian friend, Roy Eckhart, a great theologian who also was greatly responding to the Shoah. I said, the answer is, I believe the covenant is broken in the sense that God has no right to order us. Wiesel once said, when God asked us to take a mission to reach out to the world, that was legitimate and I accepted it. He said, but he failed to tell us it was a suicide mission, and that wasn't fair. Mm-hmm. That's what Eckhart wrote. He said, he thinks God should apologize and repent because he gave the Jewish people this covenant, which exposed them to murder and death, and he didn't save them. My resolve of this tension was to say, look, the Jewish people has accepted the covenant and they're really totally committed. They're living it as almost never before at the level of intensity and life and accomplishment, redemption. So I said, it must be simply the covenant is broken, that God no longer can order you. You can't order people to go on a suicide mission, not if you love them. What you can do is ask them, please, would you like to go? I need this mission, and it is risky. So I concluded, voluntary covenant, that's what we're living through, that the Jewish people released from command and obligation voluntarily chose to live this way. And the best proof was they were living this way incredibly in every level of, there was more, 80% of the rabbis and Talmidei Chacham alive in 1939 were dead by 1945. 30% of the Jewish people, but 80% of the religious teachers and scholars, because they were mostly living in Poland and Russia, where 90% were killed. So yet, by the time I came on the scene, there were more Jews learning Torah full-time. There were more Talmidei Chacham. Hadar didn't exist in pre-Shoah. So here were these incredible flourishing renaissance of Torah teaching in the face of what had been a broken and destroyed world of Torah. And one could go on in every way. The Jewish people, as I said, came home to Israel and took 600,000 people, took on, and they grew as they've grown in 70 years to 9 million, I believe, citizens of Israel. Close to 7 of them are Jewish. It's an extraordinary response of life to death. The only thing here, when I got through saying voluntary covenant, the truth is a lot of friends and people I think who believed in this argued that I was mistaken, that would lose the power of obligation, the power of commitment, if you call it voluntary. So that shook me, I would say. Didn't totally convince me. I still believe I tried this, it was rejected. There's a famous Talmudic passage that says, greater is the one who is commanded and does the commandments than one who is not commanded, but who does them voluntarily. I said, maybe not. Maybe it was true then, but maybe we're living in an age when the one who does it voluntarily is greater. Mm-hmm. Didn't get very far. Anyway, to make the final point here, the more I wrestled with this, the more I realized I had really missed the point, I believe. If you take the Shoah seriously, began to look at the covenant again. And this is my conclusion. In the biblical period, covenant meant a partnership. But clearly, according to the Torah, God is totally dominant partner, controls history, controls what happens. If the Jewish people are faithful to God, then they win against their enemies. When the enemies win, it's because the Jews betrayed the covenant or didn't, or went to other gods instead of our God, and so on. That's the biblical vision. I came to see the rabbis had a very different understanding. And I believe the obvious question is what led them? And my answer seems to be clear. The second destruction of the second temple, when you think about it, they should have won according to the biblical image, right? Unlike the first temple, the second temple, they revolted against Rome because they wanted more God. They wanted to drive the pagans out of the temple. They wanted to be more faithful to Jewish. They wanted to get the impurity of the pagans out of the temple. So this was a revolt for God. So according to the biblical model, they should have won. God should have split the Mediterranean Sea, drowned the Roman legions, and they should have won, but they lost. The rabbis, in coming to grips with this, have a profoundly important insight. The rabbis said, what made this second destruction possible, it's sins, but it's a totally different idea of sins. It's that God had self-limited. Transformation point. Mm-hmm. God had renewed the covenant. To enter the covenant, God self-limits because the partner gets responsibility. But now God had self-limited again, saying, humans, you must take more responsibility, your most power. This is the period of the rabbinic tradition developing Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, meaning God stops prophecy, stops giving you all the clear orders. And if you want to know what God wants, you have to study the tradition, you have to study your time and apply the tradition. So the human partner really becomes the uncoverer, the discoverer of revelation. No more voices from heaven. Right. So the point of God's self-limitation was humans take more power, more responsibility, more authority. And what happened in the Second Temple, the rabbi said, you look at the Talmud and Gittin, the Jews misbehaved. They had civil war and internal strife. If you intend to defeat the world's largest military power, you can't afford to have a civil war on the side. Well, the rabbis talk about the foolishness of Zechariah and of Killip. There were a kind of a religious legalism that was blind to making compromises that would have enabled the Jews to get around the Romans. Instead, he refused to let them put up a sacrifice on the emperor, leading to the Roman anger and invasion. Or the reverse, the recklessness of the zealots. They revolted against Rome, but again, irresponsibly, when there was no real chance of winning. And they were so extremist that they killed anybody who disagreed with them. They burned the food stores of Jerusalem to force the Jews of Jerusalem to fight instead of hiding behind the walls. I mean, so the point is the rabbis conclude it's the age in which humans are more responsible. And if God does not overrule natural law or step into history and correct your mistakes and save you because you're faithful to God, God says you're human, I've given you more responsibility. And if you act irresponsibility, I'm not going to save you. You have to take responsibility for your behaviors. Now, all I add now with the Shoah is that I came to see this evolution of the covenant was intended. And we are living, I believe, in the third stage. Again, I didn't see this at first until after the Shoah, but it's not the Shoah that causes this. I believe, looking back, that modernity was the turning point. That, as it were, God said humans take on even more power. In the greatness of modernity, Zionism is a good example. Don't wait for the Messiah. And don't say God will save me. What you have to do is take responsibility. Rav Kook saw that the so-called secular Zionists, who said, I'm not going to wait, I'm going to go to Israel and build it, they were carrying out God's wishes. So as it were, God invited the Jewish people, all of humanity, to take power. And this period has been a period of extraordinary accomplishment by taking power. Science, medicine, new heights of curing diseases, industry, new heights of wealth, and food distribution at a level that never was achieved before. That's the good news of this. But because the religious people and because many other people didn't understand this was a call to take power, it was a call to live by natural responsibility. As I tell people, it's not that there's no miracles. There's more miracles than ever before, but all these miracles are done by God through human agents and through natural law. When human minds apply to chemicals and discover they have the power to kill cancer, when human minds are applied to sound waves and they discover the iPhone and how I can speak here thousands of miles away from the people who are hearing me. So this is my conclusion, that the Shoah reminds us or teaches us what, in fact, we should have learned before by ourselves. We're living in an age when God has asked humans to step up and become the truly managing partners of this covenant, that we're fully responsible for our behavior, that we have to take power as never before. And the truth is, modernity took power in industry, in commerce, and agriculture. The tragedy was that they lost the sense of covenant, of partnership, of accountability, that you have a higher power before you have to answer. And so what industry has turned into global warming. Science has turned into sometimes a value-free experimentation on human lives that is not appropriate and not religiously or morally proper. And one could go on and on. Israel's exercise of power. We have to very real way estimate and assess our use of power to make sure we don't become abused. And not that Israel is without flaw, although I believe it's gotten mostly a bad judgment, raw, unfair deal in judgment, and that it has achieved a high level of a power ethic, which is flawed but good. So all I'm saying is, this is the latest stage of my understanding in light of the Shoah, is that full human responsibility, and this is the contribution of the rabbis now, not because God doesn't care. According to the rabbis, when God takes less control, God becomes more present. If you look at the Bible, the God who split the Red Sea, but this was a God of macho, high voltage presence. If you came too close, you touched God, or you touched the ark, or you touched the temple, you get wiped out. The rabbi said God is self-limited to come closer. So Hashem is hidden. The miracles are hidden. We're living in the age of Purim, when the miracle is not splitting the sea visibly, but where human initiative saves the day, and where God is hidden behind the scenes. Well, this is the age we're living in spades. And we're fully responsible in both senses of the word, that we have to take maximum power, otherwise Israel wouldn't be alive. Jewish people would be vulnerable. Again, we see anti-Semitism. At the same time, we have to hold ourselves to the standards of the vision of priority of life and morality and justice. In our exercise of power, we have to wrestle to make sure it doesn't go out of control, as industry has gone out of control, or as agriculture has gone out of control. This is our major task before us, and I feel that's another reason why we have to study and wrestle with the Shoah. It teaches us that powerlessness is not viable anymore. The Jewish people wasn't the only ones who learned the lesson. We've had, since World War II, women's liberation movements, gay liberation, African-American liberation, worldwide anti-colonial liberation. The whole world got this message that we have to take power in order to assure dignity and value and goodness. The problem, which the whole world didn't necessarily get, is how will you use that power when you get it? And we see, like with the Ukraine invasion, that people who have a lot of power can abuse terribly. They can abuse more than people who are powerless. So it's this challenge, which we are all living together. I'll finish this side of the comment with one example of what I mean. Looking back now, I say, where was God during the Shoah? Well, the answer is obvious. God was everywhere. More hidden means more present. That means that God was starving in the ghettos, that God was asphyxiating and choking in the gas chambers, that God was, the Talmud says that when human beings are sick, God says, I have a splitting headache. Can you imagine the splitting headache of living through the Shoah, or a genocide in Rwanda, or a genocide in the Uyghur China right now? So this is the human responsibility. And if you look at the record of the Shoah, this is the paradox. As total as the Nazis' enmity was, and as total as the extermination, and of course they have the blame and the responsibility. But the bottom line was, everywhere where there was sympathy, where the surrounding population were not bystanders or collaborated, worse, where they were sympathetic, Jews survived. More Jews survived. In Denmark, 95% of the Jews survived. In Bulgaria, the Bulgarian Jews survived because their fellow Bulgarians stood up for them and wouldn't turn them over to the Nazis. And where they didn't care, the same Bulgarians, they were Nazi allies. The Nazis rewarded them with Greek provinces, Thrace and Macedonia. There were Jews there. Those Jews were not Bulgarians. They turned them over to Nazis and they were almost all killed. So the answer, clearly, we learned from the Shoah, is that it's human responsibility, and that the murderers must be blamed and must be stopped by power. But the people who stood by, including the Allies, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, including a lot of great people, they have a serious moral guilt on their hands too. So this is the age of human power and human responsibility, and this is in our hands.
It's a tall order and an intimidating thing to really acknowledge, to say, actually, human responsibility, this is really on us. I want to say, by way of closing in these last 2 minutes, I want to both thank you and tell everyone that, you have so much more thinking to offer on this, and that to, again, just direct people that the Project Zug course that Rabbi Yitz put together offers a lot to dig into on this question of what does it mean to live in the moment of human responsibility, in directions of, how do we work towards a messianic era? How do we approach children in new life? How do we think about the state of Israel? How do we think about pluralism and all of these different aspects of your thinking that integrate into this question of what do we learn from the Shoah and how do we have to live moving forward?
Thank you for saying that. Let me interrupt 60 seconds or less.
That's what you have, 60 seconds.
The Shoah, the Holocaust is such a momentous weight. I mean, millions killed, and the weight. So the weight is like on the scales of justice and the scales of history, what's going to win, good or bad, life or death, is a tremendous weight thrown on the side of death and immorality and cruelty and oppression. So it seems to me our responsibility is we have to match it, not just with extra effort, but with massive effort. In fact, in my judgment, messianic effort, in other words, we have to step up. So again, one of the things I love about Hadar is commitment to egalitarianism. I believe in the tradition that someday we'll get to that level too. But to say we can't wait and we have to push faster and harder, whether it be egalitarianism for women, whether it be the dignity of gay people, whether it be a thousand examples, whether all humans and not just Jews or not just Marians, Aryans, but everybody. So that seems to me is what really, and I hope it's intimidating, but I'd say I hope you'll welcome the challenge, which is that we not only have to do better and work faster and harder, but that we have to also at the same time hold ourselves and push ourselves to keep this dialectic. In other words, you don't lose patience and you don't walk away. You don't make the mistake of revolutionary movements that decided it's not going fast enough, so you have to wipe out the people or oppress them. But this combination, pushing at a higher and faster level, that I think is what we have to do right now. Sorry.
Amen.
I could say more, but maybe in the project we'll talk about it.
I just want to thank you so much for your wisdom that you shared here today through the Project Zug course, throughout your career. I'm just so grateful for this learning and for our continued learning on this topic. And I just want to wish everyone a meaningful day. Thanks.
Thank you.